So why did you get involved in the men's movement?
Well, I've been involved in the men's movement for quite some time, but initially I got interested and started. I was an equalities officer for a trade union, and we made contact with Women's Aid and Bowsel, and I helped to raise funds and get equipment in there. And I tried, as an equalities officer then, I tried to do the same thing with the men's, for male victims of domestic abuse. And I realised that there was hardly anything there. Well, there was, in Wales, it's called the Dean Project, but they get very, very little funding. There's very little places for male victims of domestic abuse, hardly any refuge places at all. Well, in fact, there's only one place in the whole of Wales where a man could flee domestic abuse with his children. So that means that he either has to stay with the perpetrator and with his children, or if he leaves, he'd have to leave the children behind, and then he could risk losing contact with them for good, even though he's the victim. And it works a completely opposite way for, you know, for women and girls. And the other thing is, refuges, women's refuges, only take boys up to a certain age. So if you had like a 16-year-old son and a 14-year-old son, the 16-year-old couldn't go into refuge with you, so you would have to make that decision. So I realised that there was a lot of discrimination, especially around male victims of domestic abuse. But then I see further areas where men and boys are affected. Fathers especially, I mean, this is quite personal. I don't see some of my grandchildren, and because it was such a big part of my life, and it became like a living bereavement. I knew they were there, couldn't see them, whatever. I looked for support, and I joined an organisation called Families Need Fathers, Both Parents Matter. That gave me some support. I became very active within it, and I know of people that are going through the family court system, men going through the family court system, are victims of malicious allegations, and the whole thing about having contact with their children is such a terrible fight. These are dads with no safeguarding issues. You know, there's absolutely nothing wrong. They're squeaky clean, but mum is in complete control over those children. Family courts don't support a bias then against men, and it's awful. We see so many families, and it's not just the dads, the whole of the paternal family tends to suffer as well, and it is such terrible impact on the children, on their development and their mental health. It's so very, very important for them to know that both parents love them. That's one. There's several areas that mental health issues. There's lots of impact that contact denial has on men and boys. I'm from Wales. I'm from Cardiff, and recently we've had a bill going through the Welsh Assembly. It's now going for royal assent, and it's the violence against women with a clause that prioritises girls. And even though there's stats out there that say that women are predominantly the victims of domestic abuse, it doesn't say the same that girls are. So any family where domestic abuse is prevalent, its children are the most vulnerable victims, yet they've prioritised girls. So it's the whole culture is discriminating against boys and you know, men and boys. It's having terrible impacts families and family life.
And how do you see this impacting on men's health in particular?
Well, in Wales in particular, we have, is overwhelmingly men are suicide victims. It's increasing. I think it's gone up 25% this in this last 2 years, where women's suicide rates are decreasing. I'm pretty sure in the way that we see men come into our Families Need Fathers meetings, contact denial has a terrible impact on men's mental health. It really, I don't think there are any stats there saying, you know, that so many men commit suicide because of contact denial. But when families separate, it's the mum normally keeps the house, the children. Dad has to then pay maintenance, and rightly so, to support his children. But this payment can go on and on, and even though he has no contact, they can deny contact, but he still has to provide. Even when mum has a new partner and moves on, he still has to provide, you know, for his children. Men end up homeless, you know, because of this, because of the financial impact. And again, homeless men and the suicide rate. Men are predominantly the homeless then. There are some women out there, but it's nowhere near, it's overwhelmingly men. And it's overwhelmingly men as they commit suicide. But if we apply the same principles to the Violence Against Women bill, that they have now, they prioritise the women who are predominantly the victims, shouldn't they be doing that the same thing about suicide? You know, suicide prevention should be male suicide prevention, if we're applying the same logic, which I don't think they should, but I think victims are victims and should be given equal support and respect. But it's almost as if in Wales now, because it'll travel, this bill, it'll be in Westminster before we know it, it's almost as if men don't feel pain, men don't bleed, men don't, you know, don't hurt. It's become so. I'm a grandmother of boys as well as girls, and I think, what is the future? Please God, they never become victims. But what if they did? There's nothing there for them to support them. It's really worrying.
So why do you support justice for men and boys?
Well, I'm really tired of what I see as the battle of the sexes, kind of competitive struggle between men and women. And through my work as a psychotherapist and in life generally, I've just noticed how many ways men are discriminated against, or how many injustices there are, which don't seem to be recognised. The area I'm most interested in is intimate partner violence, and justice for men and boys' understanding of domestic abuse is quite close to my own understanding of domestic abuse, and different from any other party's understanding of it.
And how do you understand domestic abuse?
Well, I think popularly it's understood as the male is the aggressor, the male is the persecutor, perpetrator, and the female is the victim. But in my practice as a psychotherapist and in the research that I've done, and the considerable amount of research that others have done in the UK, in America, in Canada, actually the statistics would show that there's much more symmetry in terms of domestic abuse in relationships, i.e. men and women are much more equally abusive towards each other. With the idea of domestic abuse, more often than not, in 86% of cases, according to Michael Johnson, are co-created. So I'm advocating a non-gendered approach to domestic abuse, which closely mirrors Justice for Men and Boys policy on domestic abuse.
But aren't men doing really well in our society?
Well, you know, it's come to my awareness that actually men are not doing very well in a number of ways, actually. If you think about school curricula, a lot of the school curricula doesn't suit boys. They're not achieving as highly as girls, and I do think that's a problem, and it's a problem that's not being addressed. There's higher suicide rates for men, particularly young men, and I think that's a big problem, and I think we ought to be looking at that and doing more about that. They're more likely to be the alienated parent. There are women who are alienated parents, but the majority are men. And I think everyone loses out if men can't see their children or have contact with their children. They're treated as aggressors and perpetrators, and thought to be. They're seen as guilty before proven innocent, which is the other way around for women, who are always seen as the victims. There are more ways too, but those are a few of the most striking ways in which they're not doing very well. I also think it's kind of okay in our culture to not respect men very much, to ridicule them, make jokes about them, in a way that if you did that about women, I think there'd be uproar. It wouldn't be stood for. But it seems okay to be mean to men.
You seem to have unconventional views about men. So I guess could you explain to me how you see men?
I think if you take away the conditioning that family imposes, that society imposes on men and women, I think there are more similarities than differences. And I think that we experience the world in similar ways, and that we have similar needs.
Well, I guess the next question is, what is your vision for the future?
Do you know, in the world of intimate, personal partner violence, I'd like to see refuges for men and women combined, and I'd like to see them working together in groups to heal and recover. One of the things that attracted me to Justice for Men and Boys is the fact that they've got love in their strapline. They talk about and the women who love them, and that's very attractive to me. And I don't see love as a kind of fluffy thing. I see it as quite a robust, respectful phenomenon, which unites us all, and through being united, I think we can heal and grow and become the best we can be, whatever our sex. So that's my vision for the future.
So you formed the party 2 years ago, and I understand in the last couple of months you've had a mainstream media breakthrough. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Indeed. There was an online news service which interviewed me at some length and did a piece. I won't name it because they did a savage attack on Paul Elam, the boss of Voice for Men. But it led to immediate mainstream media coverage. Within a couple of hours of that being published, I was called to go on the This Morning programme, the ITV's This Morning programme the next morning, where I had the joy of sitting next to Caroline Criado Perez, a well-known radical feminist campaigner, and they referred to the fact that she had won 2 Lying Feminist of the Month awards, and asked her why, and she said, because I lied. For a lie that she told on that programme, she won her 3rd Lying Feminist of the Month award. So it was, altogether, it was a pretty joyous experience for me, I've got to say. But we had then lots of newspapers. We've had coverage in, I struggle to remember them all now, but the Telegraph, Guardian, Observer, Daily Mail, Express, Newsweek, and a couple of others. But we basically had more mainstream coverage in the space of, I guess, of 2 or 3 weeks than we'd had in 2 years. So it was a tremendous breakthrough for us. And we had very high numbers of blog hits. I think one day we hit over 14,000, which is slightly above our general going rate, it's got to be said. No, we were very pleased with that. And I was called only recently, I mean, an even bigger breakthrough for us. I had a call from a guy at the International Business Times, which has a global reach of something like 50 million people a month. And they've taken me on as a columnist every 2 weeks, and paying me for that, I'm pleased to say. And it's the first time, to the best of my knowledge, that a men's rights advocate has had a platform to present men's issues. And we think it's a sign of the future. We think the media are learning how to make money out of men's rights, because if they get lots of hits to that, then it pleases the advertisers do well, and we think that's now going to be a sort of a virtuous circle. And
I guess with the general election being less than 8 weeks away, how are you planning to spend that time?
Okay, well, we're having to spend a bit of a time at the moment just appearing in front of the cameras for things like documentaries. So we were filmed today by a film crew outside the University of Nottingham for a documentary which is going to be broadcast probably next year. A BBC film crew filmed us in exactly the same spot about 2 weeks ago. But outside of these these media things, we're campaigning on the streets. We're handing out leaflets door to door, which is a bit of a killer for an old man like me. But I mean, on one day I managed to shift, along with Ray Barry, one of our candidates, about 1,500 leaflets, and we plan within the next couple of weeks to be distributing about 40,000 in our 3 constituencies. And we have a particularly high number to put through the letterboxes in Ashfield, because it's the seat of Gloria De Piero, the Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. So we had twice the print run for that as for the other 2 seats.